Hi, this is Catherine. This is Taking Tea with Catherine. This is Hardy and Sons Tower of London tea, which I've always liked the flavor of. I'm not as big into flavored teas per se as I used to be, but there's room in my heart for some of these, especially this particular one. And I thought it was appropriate for what I'm going to talk about today because, well, both of the books have something to do with either London or the Tower of London. So, yeah, and it's just, I just love this tea so much. But I am doing my wrap up for November, and I centered on nonfiction books for the month of November because that is what I do in November, which does not mean that I don't read anything, fictional novels, whatever, but try to do a little more. I'm still on my very slow at finishing books phase this year, and I am not regretting it because, again, most of the books I'm reading, I'm enjoying, and I'm just not finishing all of the books that I'm reading, and eventually most of them will be. So I'm in a pretty happy place for the most part. Um, but I will speak of these two. One of them is not technically a nonfiction book, but I just felt it worked. I felt it worked, and so that's why I'm going to talk about that one first. And the other one I'm going to probably ramble on a little bit because it has to do with history and some things that have been going on in the world of history. It's related, so yeah, get ready. Make yourself a cup of tea or something, or maybe some coffee. This first book is a book that I picked up in London last year when I finally got to go back. Sadly, I couldn't go back this year, but I don't want to be expecting everything. But it was in Hatcher's in Piccadilly, which is a really beautiful shop. My friend had picked it up first, and I said, "Oh, this is a writer that I love. It's a mystery genre I love, and etc." And so this is Christopher Fowler's Bryant and May's Peculiar London. And I also, I knew I was going to read it at some point, but just because I buy a book doesn't mean I'll read it that day, even if it looks like something I want. Then in March, I found out that Christopher Fowler had died, and I was very sad about that. So I read another book that I hadn't read of his before in the Peculiar Crimes Unit series, which this is related to. And I still have actually, I have two books left of his that I haven't read that I know of related to this. And so it's not over yet, but maybe one day I'll reread too, because that's always a thing. Um, but this one I decided to read starting in June because Janelle Tufana Books had died in June, also very unexpectedly. And I was very sad about that. And some other booktubers had decided to do a little bit of a readathon for her. And I knew I wouldn't finish whatever I picked right away because it was going right into Jane Austen July. But I thought, I could continue reading it throughout the year. And I had thought, well, a mystery genre would be the most appropriate for something that she would have worked with Janelle. But it turns out this actually isn't a mystery novel, although I wouldn't be surprised if you would find it in the mystery section of your bookshop or library. But the reason why I thought it then worked for finishing in November is because it takes the fictional characters in this series, Arthur Bryant and John May, especially Arthur Bryant. He is, they're both elderly detectives in this particular unit that solve crimes that the rest of the police in London do not really want to handle, and they're kind of weird, peculiar, in other words. And most of the time, in the midst of detecting, Arthur Bryant gets all, tied up with folk tales and all kinds of old pagan rituals and also history. And he also does tours of London in the midst of all this as well. And yeah, so he, uh, it seems a little weird, but then it always gets pulled together in a much more logical explanation. But that's just usually the formula of the books. This is taking those little bits of knowledge of London that Arthur Bryant has been fond of relaying throughout the books and making it his own, almost like a memoir slash guidebook about London itself, especially the peculiar things, the weird things about London. And it's like as if it's been taken as a transcribed from a recording, a voice recording from him, and other people in his unit and other specialists and other friends that he knows that he ties in here and there. So most of the time, all the time, I think, when I fact checked anything that was said about London in here in history, geography, it it really did actually match up. So it does feel like, even though it's told by fictional characters, it's generally a nonfiction book. So if you like reading about London, and if you've already read the series at some point or some of the series, this book might be for you. If none of these is true, I can't completely recommend it, but I loved it very much so. Someone is singing outside, not terribly, but I don't know who it is. Anyway, it's not karaoke night, it's wrap up time. But anyway, I actually like karaoke though. Anyway, I'm going out of the shot here because there's nowhere to put my teacup. I'm in a weird space right here, right now. So I really love this book, and I am glad I was able to read it this year. And then we come to a book that I actually started in September, toward the end of September, and then realized I was going into Victober and wanted to focus on that. So I, decided to keep it for nonfiction November because it is a biography and is very much in line with what I've been reading a lot of this year. And this is Matthew Lewis's Richard III, Loyalty Binds Me. It is a biography on Richard III written by, I believe he's the chairman. I know he's a pretty high position in the Richard III Society. So some may say, oh, well, this is going to be a little bit biased because he's going to be completely in favor of making Richard look good. And he does not hide the fact that he's interested in doing that. But what I appreciate about it, as someone who is, I don't call myself a Ricardian because well, first of all, I don't attach myself to any human, honestly. It's like, just because I like things, I do not want to give myself titles, but I would call myself, I'm already a British history enthusiast. I do find reading about the kings and queens of England very interesting, and two of the time periods that I'm mostly wrapped up in, also I like Victorian times, other things too, but I really do like to read about the Wars of the Roses and the Tudor era. So years ago, I read a good amount of fiction, historical fiction, about all of these times and many different people. But Richard III would come up, and I did read a lot of fiction that was sympathetic to Richard III, and I would also read fiction and nonfiction that wasn't sympathetic to him. And I like to read every point of view. I don't mind reading dissenting that says he is, he did some of the things that he's been accused of. For instance, very short history lesson, he was the younger brother of the King of England, Edward IV. He was, like the title says, a very loyal Duke of Gloucester. He served his brother's interests very well. He fought with him and for him, and was basically administering the north of England very well. And no complaints about him, except for maybe a couple of nobles who didn't like that he sometimes made decisions not in their favor, which, you're going to clash with people. But when his brother died, his brother left two male heirs and then daughters as well. When Richard III, well, he wasn't Richard III yet. When Richard, with the Duke of Gloucester, came, he had been named as protector, and I still am not sure if he was supposed to be something like a regent or part of the council, because I've seen different angles on this. And what happens is he intercepts the now king, Edward V, who was about 12 years old, or meets up with him, whatever you want to say, has his maternal uncle and I think half-brother or someone arrested, and eventually they were executed, and brings him to London. Edward V ends up in the Tower of London, which wasn't necessarily a prison for a future, a soon-to-be coronated king. It was often where kings would be housed before their coronation. So this wasn't necessarily a bad thing, but his mother, the Dowager Queen, took this as an attack, as I guess anyone would at this point. And she took the rest of her children into sanctuary with her in Westminster. And so, who knows what she thought. And eventually she was persuaded to give up her younger son to join his brother in the Tower. Now, technically, Edward V was considered a king, but they are known now as the princes in the Tower. Shortly after this, information seemed to come to light that Edward IV, the recently deceased king, had been married, I guess, bigamously, or had some kind of contract with someone before his wife, who was now in sanctuary. Therefore, his children by her were all illegitimate. Therefore, Edward V could no longer be king, and therefore, next in line would be Richard. Therefore, Richard III. So now it's a little bit of a stretch. I mean, was there real evidence? I don't know. I've seen reasons arguing why Richard thought this was a good idea to take on the kingship, why it might have actually been good for the country, because having a minor as a king was usually historically not a great thing for England. So if it would have just stayed at that, you might have said, okay, that's not cool for, just, it seems almost like a usurpation. There were a couple of other people that were executed. Whether it was justified or not, it depends on how you look at the law of the time. But the problem was that these two princes of the Tower, so-called, were never heard from again after 1483. And many had concluded that they either died or who knows. So if they would have died, then the blame would go to Richard III, because, well, he's the one who put them in the Tower. And if they had died of illness, well, still kind of his responsibility. Also, if he had put them to death on purpose, that's obviously his, his decision. But did he do that? We don't know. Did he order someone else to do it? Did he not order anyone else? Did someone thought he wanted it? Did someone else do it to make trouble? Did someone else do it to make room for someone else? We don't know. And this book, what I liked about it was more balanced than I expected, because what he would do is say, look, Richard could have done this, the bad thing, he could have decided this, and this could have been true, or alternatively, this could have happened, using different historical documents. And I like that, because it didn't make him just completely blind to the fact that Richard III might have done some things that we would not really approve of. But it also gives the option of, he was of his time. He may have felt he had no other choice. Maybe there were circumstances that were beyond his, knowing, that, who knows. So I like that. I did appreciate this book. I did think it was well written. There were two things that I had a problem with personally. One is that the writing, the font is small. And I know people are going to say read digitally. I don't prefer to read digitally. But as I get older, my vision is not, well, it's never been great, but now for small writing has become more difficult. So that was a struggle, but not impossible. In the right light, I was good. But he also did a lot of quoting from historical like correspondences and everything. If they were translated from French or Dutch or something, they were just written in kind of the vernacular, or whatever you want to call it, of our time. But here it was written in, if it was, from a source that was written in English, like say a letter that Richard III had written or something, or a proclamation that he had, it was written in the English of that time, which was difficult for me to read. Not impossible, except for a few words here and there that I just looked at 1,000 times and said, it's not happening. Googled it, nothing was happening. Why I don't like that is because, yeah, it may be dignifying me, thinking that I have that historian ability in me to translate things, and to a point I do, because sometimes you can sound things out. The word realm sometimes looked like realms. So I don't know how they pronounced things back then, because we do not have recordings. They did not have standardized spelling, so it could be quite confusing, and sometimes it was just too much labor for my head, and I don't feel bad in admitting that. I don't think that makes me lazy. I also think that it might have slowed down my reading a little bit, and like I said, I'm trying not to get centered on the fact that I haven't been finishing as many books as I used to be doing, but I also would like to make quicker progress in some types of writing. So that was a thing that if I would have given this book 5 stars, this at least put it down half a star, if Goodreads would let me give things half a star, which it usually doesn't. But again, I'm not gonna sweat it. I just think that if those are the kind of things that bother you, but what the reason why I said I'm going to ramble a little bit is because I happen to be reading this book at a time when another big thing comes out regarding the subject. So just going a little further into Richard III, and I might have mentioned this earlier this year, I saw the movie called The Lost King, which was, I think that's what it's called, The Lost King, which was about Philippa Langley, who was the person who was most responsible and did the work that led to the discovery of Richard III's remains in a car park in Leicester, and which also her efforts helped him have a proper reinterment in a, as befitting a royal person. She is very much a Riccardian, of course, but she is very. I think it's amazing that she has, she did all this because she wasn't, an outright historian. But much as I do admire this about her, I feel like there are some people that put her in a light where she can do no wrong. However, it did spur me on to want to read more nonfiction about Richard III, at least read the gaps where I hadn't read before. So I got to do a lot of reading this year on that subject, and I enjoyed it. And I read different points of view, and it was pretty great. But then just in November, there was the release of her book, Philippa Langley, regarding the Princes of the Tower, and what she believes and what her supposed evidence would have us believe that the princes did not die in the tower, but that they somehow were they left. They were let go or brought out by somebody, probably Richard III's people, and brought to the continent, where they lived a good portion of their life and were probably the pretenders in the next reign of Henry VII, Lambert Simnel, and especially Perkin Warbeck, who both of them, but especially the second one, gave a lot of trouble to Henry VII in his reign, and which never bothered me because I said, well, look, you're gonna take over the kingship. You're gonna have kill, well, have, wasn't he that killed Richard III, but his people killed Richard III in battle, and you're gonna have to deal with what comes next. However, this book and the documentary, I didn't read the book yet because I can't get a hold of it because I don't feel like buying it for $30. Right now, I'm really trying not to buy too many books, and I'm trying to rely on the library system when I want to read a book that's come out recently, but it's not in my library, and I don't know when it's going to be in my library, so I must wait. However, I did see the documentary. I saw the UK version. I got to see it on YouTube. That came with it, where she had, I believe, a British, some kind of celebrity judge who looked at the evidence that she had uncovered, some of which I found out later had already been known. But anyway, that seems to have pointed to different evidences that these boys did get out. And the reason why, I'm pretty sure everybody realizes this, the reason why she's doing this is to exonerate Richard III, to make it look like, well, he didn't have them killed, so he's basically a good guy. And that's not a bad thing if that's what you want to prove, but it's not necessarily what I believe. And I know I haven't read the book, so, and I'm not a historian. If I would call myself a historian, it'd be very, very amateur, secondary sources, definitely not firsthand. I'm not looking at original documents on my own. But I've just seen things that you would call reasonable doubt. Like I said, I would like to think that Richard III wasn't altogether a bad dude, but I also know that he was a monarch, and pretty much anyone in power, both then and probably now, have had to do things that aren't necessarily admirable, that aren't necessarily moral, that aren't necessarily things that we would call good. I would just think, I believe that what I would like with regards to Richard III isn't to make him sound like an angel or a saint or anything. I don't care for that kind of mentality. Just to make him look like, okay, he did some bad things, but basically on a level with everyone else, almost every other king, you know? That would be fine with me. But what bothers me, I think, is that it's the absolutes. So I know there were some Ricardians who saw the these new the new book, the who saw the documentary, and they immediately said, "Oh, this proves everything. All the dissenting historians are quaking in their boots, and Philippa's done it again, and all this stuff." Now, and then there are probably some people who will never be convinced otherwise that Richard III is a monster, and that he is basically like the villain of Richard III's, the Shakespeare Richard III, and I do not like these absolutes. I like the discussion of it's possible, but we really can't say. I could say what I want to feel about it, but you cannot say. You can only look at what we have and say these are the theories. So yes, it's still an interest of mine, but I just don't like the absolute. Well, I don't like any kind of absolute faith in any person, but I could admire certain people's work efforts and intentions, but I cannot look at anybody and say, oh well, they are infallible. And I'm not even talking about Richard III. I'm talking about Philippa Langley right now. I think she's done a lot of good research and a lot of work, but I do not understand this. This complete. Oh yeah, everything she does is going to be absolutely amazing. This is not how people are. Anyway, that's my ramble. Why I'm kind of glad I was reading this book right now, just because it put me in the mode of being right in the center of all the information. But I also feel that there's been no great breakthrough. The only thing that I had to say as a benefit is that it anytime, because I love talking about history, so anytime history is being talked about a lot, it's kind of fun for me that there is something going on. I do appreciate that there are a number of historians, whichever side they're on, in terms of where Richard III lays in terms of reputation or whatever. There are a good number of them who are willing to entertain each side and be reasonable and not mean about the other side. I know at least one who has been saying online, don't just read my stuff. Read Philippa Langley, read Matthew Lewis, read the different points of view. He may not I may not believe that that the Prince of the Tower escaped, or that that they weren't murdered or whatever, but I also think that you should look at every side. And I like that. I like that reasonableness. So that's all for me. Obviously, I get really excited about these things, but I enjoy it. I enjoy it. So that is my update for what I have been reading recently, what I've finished anyway. I have a lot more that I am currently reading, and I hope to talk about them soon. And I will hopefully come back soon to talk about some of my December reading plans, most of which probably won't be coming to fruition, but we still talk about it. And I would like to know your opinions on both of these books, if you've read them or if you know of some of these subjects, and what you think of it. And I hope you've enjoyed this video. If these are the type of things that float your boat, please follow, subscribe, and like, and all the things. And that's all for now. This is Catherine at Taking Tea with Catherine. Have a lovely tea and book-filled day. Bye.